All right, I will say good morning, a good yar. Hope that everyone is well. Baruch Hashem, a lot to do today. A great suchos to be able to begin the new year. Emeretz Hashem with the entire Chevra. Let's begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei. To thank Jerry and Sarah Wolaski for dedicating all the Shuman Drashos this month in the Schusar Fushlim for their grandsons, Zechariah Dov, Ben Parol Shira. To thank Shendin Avram Kelman for dedicating all the Shuman Drashos this month in memory of their beloved parents and the Schus of all those who need a refuah shalema. To thank Dr. Linda Weinberg for dedicating all the Shuman Drashos this month in memory of her husband, Dr. Paul Weinberg, Peretz Moshe Ben Avram. To thank Selma Wolf for dedicating all the Shuman Drashos this month with immense gratitude to Hashem with tefillos for health for all in the new year, and Leah Soul as a schus for refuah shalema for her daughter Ilana Bas Esther, and for all of those who need Yeshuas and refuahs. To thank our Day of Learning sponsor Esther Mizrahi, Le'ilui Nishmas, Lauren Levana Bas Vivian, Ezra Mizrahi's niece. May Hashem inspire the researchers in finding a cure for the eradication of bone cancer soon. Well, okay. Meretz Hashem. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, and all those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Also, with that, let us begin. A lot to do today, Baruch Hashem, and not a lot of time to do it. So it says we are picking up today's daf is Lamed Vav 36. We left off yesterday at Isi. At Isi Tani, so it says, which was in the wide lines. Well, actually, it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines up from the bottom. So remember again in yesterday's daf, we learned everything one could ever want to know about female facial hair, right? And we went through the entire sugya Baruch Hashem. And again, I think now many of us could get smicha just even in that particular area of halacha. So I'll say, so continuing along in that same, well, not same topic, but in a variation of that topic. So the Gemara says as follows: Isi Tani. Isi says as follows: Af bal yikrchu nashim pturos. Women are also exempt from the prohibition of bal yikrchu. Now, bal yikrchu ultimately is the idea that one is not permitted to pull out their hair as a display of mourning for the dead. So EC posits that women are exempt from that. Now, what's the logic over here? My time at the EC, the Darashaki, he dashed in the following. The pasuk says, "You are sons to Hashem your God." Lo tiskodadu. Now, both say gedida in this case over here means don't cut yourself. Don't cut yourself as a display of mourning for the dead. And do not go ahead and pull out your hair and make a bald spot over mourning for the dead. Why? For you are a holy nation unto Hashem your God. So Isi Darshins Banim V'lo Banos Lekarcha. So actually it's a pretty straightforward drasha. The way the Torah introduces the prohibition to pull out your hair is Banim Atemash, you are sons. Isi says, what does that tell you? The prohibition only applies to men, doesn't apply to women. So you're saying it comes to exclude women from the prohibition of creating a bald spot. Maybe it comes to exclude women from the prohibition of lacerating themselves. Kishu Omer, ki am kadosh atar Hashem Elokecha haregedida amar. Now let's remember again, the way the pasuk ends off is you are a holy nation. Holy nation includes who? Includes women, which indicates that women are included in the prohibition of laceration, but not included in the prohibition of pulling out hair, of creating a bald spot. Now, I just want to point out, the prohibition over here is dafka pulling out hair as a display of mourning for the dead. It's not just pulling out hair stam, it's pulling out hair again as mourning. So the Gemara says, how many mekayim banim v'lo banos likarcha? Ultimately, again, therefore, the pasuk says, banim is coming to say that only men are included in the prohibition of pulling out their hair, creating a bald spot, not women. So we'll say, this is the drush of Isi ben Yehuda, of Isi, that halacha l'maisa, that the prohibition of pulling out one's hair as a display of mourning for the dead only applies to men, doesn't apply to women. Where does he get that from? Banim atem l'Hashem Elokechem, you are sons. Only sons, not daughters. The second part of the pasuk, which talks about gedida, lo tiskodadu, do not lacerate yourself, do not cut yourself, he holds applies to everyone. Why? Because the end of the pasuk says, ki am kadosh, you are a holy nation. Holy nation includes who? men and women. Okay. Umar Rois, the Rabbi says, so it's interesting. So in the same pasuk, well, here's what's fascinating about this drasha. It's one pasuk, right? So it's one pasuk that talks about pulling out hair and laceration. And yet what EC does is, he says, one applies to women, one doesn't. One doesn't. So now the Gemara says, I don't understand. Why would you assume ultimately again that laceration does apply and pulling out hair doesn't? Marabani Gedida, I would include Gedida Sheyeshna b'makom se'ar, v'shlo b'makom se'ar, because we both say laceration applies both on parts of the body where there is hair and there isn't hair. In other words, the prohibition to lacerate over the dead applies on any part of the body. And I'll exclude ultimately again the karcha prohibition because it applies only on places of the body where there's hair. So I see the idea over here is I'm going to include women in the more, what we'll call the more expansive prohibition, which is laceration, because that applies to any part of the body. But I'll exclude a woman from the more limited prohibition, which is creating a bald spot, because obviously creating a bald spot only applies to a part of the body where there's hair. So the Gemara says, so I don't understand. Isi, let's make a simpler drasha. Say that the whole pasuk is coming to exclude women from everything. In other words, the pasuk is introduced, you are sons. So why not say that women are exempt from everything in that pasuk? They're exempt from creating a bald spot, and they're exempt from laceration, exempted from everything. And when the pasuk says that you are a holy nation unto Hashem your God, why not say Bisrita hu dichsiv? Maybe he's talking about Srita. I will say, here's what's interesting. The Gemara is introducing us to the possibility that there's two things. There's something called Gedida and something called Srita. Now, both of them mean cutting yourself. One of them refers to cutting yourself by hand, like I guess just like taking your nail and just like cutting yourself, scratching yourself, cutting yourself. The other applies to laceration with a utensil, with a kli. So the Gemara says, maybe the pasuk is coming to teach me that women are exempt both from gedida and karcha. V'chi kasav kiyam kadosh atal Hashem alkecha b'sritu dichsiv kasav isi srita ugedida achasi top of lamed above 36a. Isi happens. Other will say that srita and gedida are halachically the same thing. In other words, that the prohibition to cut yourself over the dead ultimately again applies whether you're cutting yourself by hand or whether you're cutting yourself with a kli. Okay, so Abai Amar. So let's pause here for just a moment. This is the position of EC. We're gonna dissect it a little bit, and again, just to understand. So kind of that this is the springboard for this conversation was a discussion about women being exempted from other prohibitions. For example, rounding out the head, removal of payas, destruction of the beard. So now EC says, by the way, women are also exempt on the prohibition of pulling out one's hair as a mourning behavior. So you are sons to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, don't pull out your hair over the dead. So EC says that dafka applies to men, doesn't apply to women. However, the second prohibition on the pasuk, i.e. laceration over the dead, whether you do that by hand or you do that with a utensil, that will apply to women. So let's analyze. So Abai says, top 36a, first line, Abai Amar, Hainu time the EC. What's EC's logic? The Gamar karcha mibnei Aaron. He has Gzera Shava of karcha. So the pasuk says there's a specific pasuk by Kohanim that says lo yikrichu karcha berosham. Kohanim are not permitted to pull out their hair as a display of mourning. There's a specific prohibition by Kohanim. So Abai says like this. It says karcha by Kohanim, and it says karcha over here in this pasuk. Just like by mitzvos of the kahuna, women are exempt. Right? In other words, we saw. Where do we see this? Where do we see this? The Mishnah. What did the Mishnah say? A woman is not prohibited from coming in contact with a corpse. In other words, a kohenes, a bas kohen, is allowed to come in contact with a corpse. What do you see from that? That a woman is generally exempted from the mitzvos of kahuna. She has certain entitlements, right? If she's a bas kohen, she can eat truma, but she's exempted from the prohibitions. So the Gemara says like this. So just like she's exempted ultimately again. So just like by mitzvos of kahuna, women are exempt. Afkan, so too in this pasuk of banim atem la Hashem elokechem. Women will also be exempt. And if you think that the pasuk is actually referring to, in other words, if you think the exemption refers to the entire pasuk, so the Gemara says, Nishtok kramine, let the pasuk remain silent, and everything could simply be learned out with a kal v'chomer. And I would have said, Uma kohanim sheriba bahena kasov mitzvos yiseros. And when it comes to Kohanim, who have more mitzvos than a typical Jew, we normally say B'nei Aaron v'lo benos Aaron. The halachas of Kahuna normally only apply to men and not to women. So therefore, again, Yisrael kol shekin, I would have said all the more so for just a regular Jew. Ilav, to which the Gemara answers, Ilav gzeir shava, without the gzeir shava, Hava Amina, I would have thought, Hefsek ha'inyan, that as we said before, that the pasuk really means to distinguish mid-pasuk between ultimately, again, Karcha and Gedido. So the Gemara says, Hashtanami nema hifsika inyan. So let's say over here now that ultimately the pasuk means to divide the two topics. V'imishum gezer shava, and if you're going to say the gezer shava mi b'ayli l'chidisanyo, you need that for the following reason. Pasuk says, Lo yikrchu, do not create a bald spot. Yachol afilu karach arba v'chamesh krachos. Lo yechayev ela achos. One might have thought, well, say, what happens if a person makes 4 or 5 bald spots? In other words, they're mourning over the dead, Rahman al-Islam, and they pull out 4 or 5 different places of hair. I would have thought that you're only chayiv once. So the Gemara says, Tamul Omar, karcha. Therefore, the pasuk says, karcha, lechayiv al kol achas ve'achas berosham, to teach you that there is independent liability for each and every bald spot that is caused. Ma Tamul Omar. So we'll say, what's the chiddush there? The fish shenemar lo tiskodedu v'lo sasimu karcha bein einechem lameis. The pasuk says, do not lacerate yourself, and do not go ahead and make a bald spot between your eyes for the dead. You might have thought, well, say now, the way the pasuk phrases it is, don't make a bald spot between your eyes. So one might have thought that you're only chayiv for pulling out hair in the area between your eyes. How do you know that you're chayiv for making a bald spot over the entire head? The pasuk says on their head, l'chayiv al harosh kabein ha'inayim. Ultimately, again, I will say that Berosham is by the Kohanim. Zechor is by the Kohanim. So to teach you that ultimately, again, you're chayiv for making a bald spot anywhere on the head, as if you made it between the eyes. V'imi ela Kohanim, sheri baba anakasa mitzvos yiseros. I only know that by Kohanim, they're chayiv for making a bald spot anywhere on the head, because in general, Kohanim have more mitzvos. So the Gemara says, Yisrael, and how do I know that by Stam a Jew, you're chayiv ultimately again for making a bald spot anywhere on the head? Nemar kan karcha, v'nemar lahalan karcha. It says over here karcha, so it says by Yisrael karcha, it says by Kuna karcha. Makan chayiv al kol karcha v'karcha, v'chayiv al harosh kabein ha'inayim. Just like ultimately again, in the first pasuk, one is chayiv for every bald spot and chayiv anywhere on the head, as if he did it between the eyes. Af lahalon chayiv al kol karcha v'karcha v'chayiv al harosh kebein ha'inayim. Umal lahalon al meis, and I will say just like over there. Remember, as I mentioned this before, the prohibition to pull out hair is dafka as a display of mourning. Afkan alames. So too over say this is important because, for example, let's say a person would just, I don't know, in a moment of just anger or stress, they pull out some of their hair. So interestingly enough, certainly not a good habit, but lamaisa, not this prohibition. This prohibition is dafka when done as a display of mourning. So we'll say imkain ma nichtov. I'm sorry, afkan alames imkain nichtov kra karach my karcha. If that's the case, why not does the pasuk just say karach? Why does it say karcha? Shamas mina tarti. Ultimately, again, I will say to teach us the 2 lessons that were mentioned above. So we'll say, so just to condense this a little bit. So first of all, just picking up a number of interesting halachas along the way. The prohibition of karcha, number 1 applies anywhere on the head, right? And number 2, ultimately, again, applies when it is done, the prohibition applies when the removal of the hair is done as a display of mourning. So we'll say, so let's just take a step back, just so we keep in mind what we're doing over here. Start with the position of Isi. What does Isi say? The prohibition of creating a bald spot, pulling out hair as mourning for the dead only applies to men, doesn't apply to women. Abaye, all Abaye is doing over here is just trying to figure out where did Isi get that. Now I will say, now the truth is, Isi himself seemed to explain his drasha, right? He gave a little bit of explanation of his drasha already. Abaye is saying on a deeper level, where does he see it? And Abaye understands it as the Gzeira Shava of Karcha to Kohanim. It says Karcha over here by the pasuk that EC quoted. Lo tiskodedu v'lo tasimu karcha b'nei nechem lameis, and it says karcha by b'nei Aaron lo yikruchu karcha birosham, and that's the whole drasha. So that's all Abaye was doing, was trying to show ultimately again where Isi ben Yehuda derives his position from. Good. Next, Rava Amar. Rava says no. Hainu time de Isi. Isi learns it out from somewhere else, which is the Yalif bein einechem mitfilin. Very interesting, Rabbi. So listen to this. He makes a drasha ultimately again of bein einechem from tefillin. How so? So we'll say, so what's the drasha over there? So by tefillin it says, right, that you go and you put tefillin bein einechem, and again the lashon over here by the pasuk is lo sasimu karcha bein einechem. Bein einechem. What's the Gzeira Shava? Here we go. The Gemara says, Ma lahalon naship turos. Afkanash pturos. But it's fascinating how like all roads lead back to tefillin. So just like by tefillin, ultimately again women are exempt. By tefillin, women are exempt. So too by karcha, women are exempt as well. Okay, that's a pretty simple, straightforward drasha. Verava, my time alo amar kabaye. So I both say. So now, essentially, just to point out over here. Now I say what I do want to point out is that halacha lamaisa. So EC's. We do not accept Isi's position lahalacha. In other words, the way we pass in halacha lamaisa is that women are subject to the prohibition of karcha. So if a woman were to pull out her hair as a display of mourning, that would be a biblical prohibition. So again, even though we don't accept the halacha lamaisa, it's still interesting. And Abaye and Rav are arguing on the logic of Isi. So Abaye's logic, where does Isi get his shita from? Gzeira Shava from Kahuna. According to Rava, where does Isi get his pshita from? Gzeira Shava to Tefillin. The Tefillin. Interesting. So the Gemara said, Rava, my time alomar kabaye. So Rava, why don't you hold like Abaye? So Rava, who holds that it's learned that from Tefillin, why don't you hold like Abaye, that it's learned that from Kahuna? To which the Gemara says, because again, remember Abaye's whole drasha is really predicated on the fact that the Torah decided to write the phrase karcha, longhand, well, I don't know if longhand, in the longer form as opposed to the shorter form. So Rava just simply doesn't subscribe to that drasha. Abaye, my time Rava, and Abaye, why doesn't he hold like Rava? Tefillin gufayhu mehacha gamarla. So listen to this. So Abaye will say, no, you can't use that drasha for tefillin because tefillin itself is an important halacha from tefillin that is learned out from here. We'll say, what's learned out from here from tefillin? So ma lahalon makom sha'osin karcha begovo shorosh afkan hanocha begovo shorosh. So we'll say, so this is incredible. So remember again, what we learn out over here. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. This is actually an incredible Rashi. Tefillin gufay mehacha gamri kolomar hahi gzeira shava de bein einechem. The gzeira shava bein einechem rosai can't be used to teach me that just like women are exempt from tefillin, so too they're exempt from karcha. Why? Because I need this gzeira shava to teach me something totally different, which is the placement of tefillin. The placement of tefillin. It says bein einechem by tefillin, and it says karcha. It says bein einechem by karcha. Just like by karcha, again, I will say, what does it mean? It's referring to over here, the hair on your head. So too over here, as opposed to literally again between your eyes. So too when tefillin says bein einechem, it means not placement between your eyes, but ultimately again placement on the hairline, placement on a place where there's hair. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Ma lahalon makom shosed karcha begovo shorosh, afkan makom anacha begovo shorosh. Incredible. So Rabbi will say again, that's why Abaye and Rava do not subscribe to one another's shita. So I will say, now watch this. This is a treat. But so listen to this beautiful Gemara to get us started with Aseret Yemei Tshuva. To really again, well, not get us started. We're continuing Aseret Yemei Tshuva, but ultimately again allow us to continue in this journey. So it says the Gemara as follows: Bein la'Abaye bein l'Rava. So both according to Abaye and Rava, Hai banim. I will say, now here's what's interesting. So again, remember, what are we doing over here? So remember again, right now, we're hyper-focused on the position of Isi, right? Isi says women are subject to the prohibition of women are exempt from the prohibition of karcha, pulling out their hair, as a demonstration of mourning for the dead. Now I will say, so Abaye and Rava are learning out, are understanding that Isi derives it from two different places. Abaye, Gezerah Shava to Kahuna, Karcha from Kohanim. Rava, Gezerah Shava to Tefillin. Gezerah Shava to Tefillin. Now, what's interesting, I just do want to point out over here something very interesting, which is when we learn the position of Isi on Lamed Hermid Beis, Isi seems to learn it out from where? Banim atam la'Hashem Elokechem. That's how Isi learns it. You are sons to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Do not pull out your hair as a display of mourning. So Isi will say, it applies to sons, doesn't apply to daughters. Okay, neither Abaye nor Rava accept that as the actual premise for Isi. Now the Gemara says, Abaye, Rava, what do you do in the pasuk with Banim atam la'Hashem Elokechem? What do you do with that phrase, right? Because you're not using it for the drasha of karcha. So what do you do with the phrase of banim atem la'Hashem Elokechem? I will say, listen to this beautiful Gemara. Here we go. Hi banim my darshibe. What do they do with it? So the Gemara says, Hi mi baile. Both say, here we go. L'chidisanyo. Banim atem la'Hashem Elokechem. Torah Kedosha says, we are sons to the Ribono Shel Olam. I might have thought, Bizman sha'atem noagim minag banim atem kriyim banim. When you act like sons, you are sons to Hashem. However, ein atem noagim minag banim. If you do not conduct yourself in the way of sons, we'll say, what's minag banim? What's the custom of sons? What does it mean to be minag banim? Obedience. Obedience, right? What's the hallmark of the relationship of a son to a father? Again, in the abstract and in the ideal, it's obedience, right? The son does, we've just finished the sugyas of Kibud Av Ve'im, right? A son does what a father asks of him, what a father needs of him. So I might have thought, when are we sons to the Ribono Shel Olam? When we act like sons. Minag banim. If I act like a son, then I am a son. On the other hand, ein atem noagim minag banim. If I don't act like a son, ein atem kriyim banim. Right? And if I don't act like a son, I'm not a son. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say in Rabbi Yehuda's view of our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, being called a son of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a privilege and an earned title. You're not automatically a son. You're only a son if you behave like a son. And what does it mean to behave like a son? Obedience to the Ribono Shel Olam. If I'm an obedient child, then I'm called a ben. If I'm not an obedient child, I'm not called a ben. This is Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir says no. Ben kach uben kach atem kruyim banim. Wow. Rabbi Meir says not true. A yid is always a son to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Whether you're obedient or you're not obedient, I listen, I don't listen, right? I'm attentive, I'm not attentive. I fulfill the Ratzon Hashem, I don't fulfill. Either way, I'm a son to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How do we know this? We'll say first wide line. The Gemara says Shne'emar banim schalim hema, because we'll say the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Yirmiyahu, where the Navi calls us foolish sons. So what do you see from here? What do you see from here? Even when you're foolish, you're still a son, right? Va'omer banim lo amun bam, but right? Or the pasuk says over here, banim lo uman bam. In other words, sons. Uman Bosa means like ne'emanos, a son who is not trustworthy. But yet, even when I'm not trustworthy, what am I called? What am I called? Still called the son. Right? Furthermore, Zera Mereyim Banim Mashchisim, destructive sons. Even when I'm destructive, I'm still called the son. Va'omer, V'hayah b'makom asher lo yomar lahem lo ami atem, yomar lahem b'nei kelchai. Even in a situation, even in a time where I will say they are not my nation, I will still say they are the sons of the living God. So in other words, even when HaKadosh Baruch Hu disavows us as a nation, we're still the children of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Va'omer, furthermore, it says, so again, so what do you see from here? What do you see from here? Rabbi Meir says, even in situations where I'm not obedient, even in situations where I'm not fulfilling or following the Ratzon Hashem, I am still called a son. They both say, do you understand the enormity of this machlokes? If this wasn't, 6:10 on a fast day morning, they'll say we'd be falling out of our seats about the nature of this machlokes. This machlokes, Rabbi Meir both say, is what does it take to be a son, a ben of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? We'll say, if you ask a person, what do you want out of life? What do you want out of life? There's a simple answer. I want to be a child of the Ribono Shel Olam. That's all. Because everything else stems from that. I want to be because if I'm a child of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that means there's a closeness. If there's a closeness, everything else stems from that. So what does it take to be a son of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Rabbi Huda will say, what did Rabbi Huda will say? Obedience. It's very simple. Obedience. Be obedient to God and you will be a son. Rabbi Meir says, no. What does it take to be a child of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? What does it take to be a child? It's a de facto state of the Jew. You don't have to do anything to be a child of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You are a child. Isn't that the most incredible thing in the world? Isn't a statement like that the most heartwarming, incredible thing? I am a child. See, that statement in and of itself, what that tells me is that the Ribono Shel Olam has an unconditional love for me. Just like parents and children, sometimes parents and children have a great relationship. Sometimes, unfortunately, they're not talking to each other, but I'm still my parent's child. So sometimes, again, I could have a strained relationship with God. I could even be a little bit estranged from God, but I'm His child. I'm His child. That is a de facto state of my life. And my behavior does not impact the nature of that relationship, that bond, one bit. I will say it's the most fundamental, I don't know, I think this machlokes is the most fundamental machlokes in the entire Shas. Is being a child of HaKadosh Baruch Hu an earned state, or is it a de facto state? Rabbi Huda, you got to earn it. Rabbi Meir, it's yours. It's de facto, it's yours. It's yours. So let's go through this. Such an incredible Gemara. So the Gemara says, "My va'omer." So we'll say, why does Rabbi Meir need to quote all of these different psukim? My va'omer, v'chi tema sakli hu demikri bini. So we'll say, ki les bu eminusa lo mikri bini. From the first pasuk of Hashem, again, by seichel means foolishness. I mean, maybe only when a person acts in a foolish way, right? That's when they're still called a child. But ultimately, again, if they totally lack credibility in their relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, maybe not. Lo mikri bini. Tashma va'omer bini lo uman bam. V'chi tema. Okay, maybe when ultimately we lack credibility in the relationship with Hashem, we're still called a son. But if I worship Avodah Zarah, Chas v'Shalom, I'm no longer a son. Tashma v'omer zera mereim banim mashchisim. Now, even if the son is destructive, which means even if the son worships Avodah Zarah, he's still a son of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'chitema. Banim mashchisim hu demikri b'ni ma'alya. Banim mashchisim hu demikri b'ni ma'alya lo mikru. Maybe you'll say when a Jew worships Avodah Zarah, he's called a destructive son, but he's not called a regular son. Tashma va'omer v'haya b'makom asher yamar lahem lo amiyatem yomar lahem b'nei kel chai. Even when I worship Avodah Zarah, Chas v'Shalom, I'm still called a son. Rabbi say, who do we paskin like? It's not even a shaila. It's not even a shaila. Not even going to look it up. Not even going to see. Rabbi say, it's clear. We paskin like Rabbi Meir. A yid is a child of the Ribono Shel Olam as a de facto state of being. It's not earned, and because it's not earned, and because it's de facto, no matter what I do in life, I cannot go ahead and break that bond. We are forever children of the Ribono Shel Olam. Rabbi say, what a message to learn, right? Now our avoda is, we'll say, what is our avoda? Now we finished Rosh Hashanah, we reestablished our relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam. Now it's about tshuva. Now it's about tshuva. And sometimes again we think to ourselves, I am too far gone to be able to do tshuva. I've done too much, too many wrong turns. No, you haven't. Because no matter what you have, whatever I have or haven't done in life, I am a son. And nothing could ever change that relationship. And because that relationship is intact, that tells me that I have the ability to fix it, to rehabilitate it, to rebuild it. No matter how much of a state of disrepair that relationship with my father has descended into, a son is always a son, is forever a son. And the ability to come back home, the ability to reignite that relationship with my father, the ability to rebuild and repair is always there. I will say that is the chizik as we begin the journey of Aseret Simei Tshuva. Incredible, incredible. Mishnah. Right, I will say, so now we're continuing in the topic over here about mitzvos that women are exempt from. So the Mishnah says, Hasmichos. So we'll say, this Mishnah says, what happens if you have a woman who is a daughter of a Kohen? A Bas Kohen, a Kohenes. So smichos, we'll say smicha is the act of leaning on the animal, right? That's what we do. We do smicha before the animal is shechted. Tenufos is the waving of the carbon. Hagashos, bringing the carbon close to the mizbeach. Kamitza, that's by the carbon mincha, the 3 fingerfuls. Haktaros, burning of sacrificial item on the altar. Malikos, that's by the bird, right? I will say again, remember, bird doesn't have regular shechita. That's with the thumbnail, back of the neck flicking off of the head. Kabbalos, receiving of blood. Hazo, sprinkling of the blood. All of these things, noagim ba'anosh v'lo b'nashim. All of these things apply to men. In other words, male kohanim, v'lo b'nashim, not women. So even if a woman is a bas kohen, she can't do any of these things. Chutz mimincha sota unezira shemaniva. Supposedly the exception is by the mincha of a sota and the mincha of a nazira, that's a female nazir, nazira, they do tenufa, they do the waving process together with the kohen of their mincha. Fine, let's analyze. Well, it's pretty straightforward. Gemara. Smichas, how do we know that a woman doesn't do smicha? D'chsiv daber el b'nei Yisrael. Pasuk says, speak to b'nei Yisrael, men. V'samach b'nei Yisrael somchin, v'samach b'nei Yisrael somchin, ve'im b'nos Yisrael somchos. Good. I'm sorry. Daber el b'nei Yisrael v'samach. So we'll say, so again, in the context of smicha, it says b'nei Yisrael, which tells me men do smicha, women don't do smicha. Good. Next, tenufos, waving. So daber el b'nei Yisrael v'henif. B'nei Yisrael manifin, ve'im b'nos Yisrael manifos. Same drasha. So by tenufa, by waving, it says B'nai Yisrael, dafka, men do tenufa, women don't do tenufa. Beautiful. Hagashos, bringing close to the mizbeach. Tichsev zos toras hamincha, hakrev osa B'nai Aaron. Pasuk says B'nai Aaron, v'lo b'nos Aaron. Beautiful. Kamisos, tichsev ve'evia el B'nai Aaron, the kamatz. B'nai Aaron, v'lo b'nos Aaron. So we'll say it's the same drasha. In all these psukim, the lashon that's used is the sons of Aaron. We learn from here, dafka, the sons of Aaron, not the daughters of Aaron. Haktaros. So we'll say again, offering up on the mizbeach. So the haktaros means the burning. Hevektiru osa b'nai Aaron, v'lo b'nos Aaron. Right? Again, sons of Aaron, not daughters of Aaron. Malikos, d'chsev umalak v'hektir. We'll say the pasuk says he'll do the malika and burn the bird. Iskish malika haktara. So malika is compared to haktara, to burning. And just as we established before, that a woman, a kohenes, doesn't do the burning, so too she doesn't do the malika. Hakabalos, receiving of blood. T'chsiv v'ekrivu b'nei Aaron. Pasuk says b'nei Aaron will go ahead and offer it up. But Amar Mar, Amar Bezer will say v'ekrivu zo kabalas adam. This refers to the receiving of the blood. Okay, vazo, sprinkling of the blood. So we'll say, so which sprinkling are we talking about? So we'll say, so like I said, pretty straightforward drushes of just b'nei Aaron v'lo b'nos Aaron. So we'll say, let's go back to vazo. So this is very interesting. So a woman doesn't do the sprinkling of the blood. Asks the Gemara, hazoas dehecha. We'll say, which sprinkling are we referring to? Or more appropriately stated, where is the particular sprinkling being done that we're referring to? Idapara. If we're talking about the sprinkling of the ashes of combined with the water of the para aduma, so we'll say, so a woman doesn't do that, but that's a different elazar kasav ba. So let's remember again, para aduma is unique because who is para aduma done by? Who is that performed by? The sgan kohen gadol, the assistant kohen gadol. So we'll say that. So that's a drasha elazar v'afilu shakon and psulim. So we'll say it can't be para aduma because by para aduma, even regular kohanim can't do it. It's only a specific kohen, right? The scan kohen gadol, the assistant kohen gadol, who does it. Idipnim. If we're talking about ultimately, again, about say like a sprinkling that's done on the interior of the Beis HaMikdash, either again on the parochas, on the curtain dividing the kodesh from the kodesh HaKadoshim, or on the golden altar, I will say. So again, HaKohen HaMashiach Kasubah. So I will say, so that ultimately only Kohen Gadol could do that. Only Kohen Gadol could do that. So what are we talking about? Ella Hazah de Ben Of. Rather, I will say we must be talking about, again, the sprinkling of the blood of a bird offering. Sprinkling of the blood of a bird offering. Hazod de ben Of. So the Gemara says, Da'asya b'kal v'chomer mi ben tzon. Because ultimately, again, the sprinkling of the blood of a bird offering is learned out from the sprinkling of what we call a ben tzon. But take a look at Rashi just a moment. Hazaz dam of, tichsib b'chatas of, v'hiza midam at chatas, v'tzrich lashmina nashim psulos, v'nal kemachar mizrikas dam da'olas ben tzon. So let's listen to this. the sprinkling of the blood of a bird, which ultimately is learned out from the sprinkling of a regular ola, an animal ola. So the Gemara says, "Ma ben son shelo kavalo kohen l'shchita, so kavalo kohen la'azah." So by a regular ola, where you don't need a kohen to do shchita, remember again, a regular carbon could be shechted by a zar. So a regular kohen doesn't need to do shchita by an ola, yet kavalo kohen la'azah does require a kohen for the sprinkling. Ben of shekavala kohen limikaso eino din shik balo la'azah. So we'll say a bird offering, which does require a kohen, right? We'll say malika dafka requires a kohen. So if the bird offering requires a kohen, ultimately again for shchita certainly requires a kohen for what? For zrika. Okay, that's the drasha. So I'll say, so remember again, so now we're just going through the list of that a woman is not permitted to do any of these sacrificial rites. Again, the interesting havamina is, one would have thought that if she's a kohenes, she could, because she's in the Kohanic family. Kamash Malon, a lot of these things are dashed from Bnei Aaron velo benos Aaron. Two exceptions, where a woman is actively involved in the waving of a carbon. What are the two exceptions? The mincha of a sota and the mincha of a nazira. Says the Gemara, Amalei Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yoshia didare. So also Rabbi Eliezer said to Rabbi Yoshia of his generation, Lo teisiv akarach, do not sit down, ad the amrit li lahashmaisisa, until you explain to me the following teaching. Minayin leminchas sota shatuna tnufa. From where do you know that a mincha of a sota requires waving? Where do I know that from? Minalon bigufadichsid. Pasuk says it, right? Vehinif esa mincha. It's Pasuk says you have to wave the mincha. Ela tnufa bebayle minayin. How do I know that the mincha of a sota is waved by the woman herself? Right, by the sota herself. So the Gemara says, Asya yad mishlamim. It's a gzerushav of yad from shlamim. So the Gemara says, Ksiv hacha v'lakacha koin miyada isha. Pasuk says where the coin will take the mincha from the hand of the woman. Uksiv hasam yadav to the ena. Makan koin, aflalan koin. Just like over here. Just like over here, it's a kohen. So to say ultimately again, by stam tenufa, it's also a kohen. Or by just like over there, it's a kohen. So to by sota, it's a kohen. Malahalan ba'bailim. Just like over there, it's with the owners. The owners do the tenufa. Afkan bailim. So to over here, the owner does tenufa as well. And I will say the problem is, then the passage is contradictory. On one hand, you're saying the kohen does the waving, and then on the other hand, you're saying the owner does the waving. So who is it? Ha-ketzad, here we go. Kohen machnis yado tachas yad bailim umeiniv. So Rabbi says, interesting halacha. Any situation where there's going to be an obligation of tenufa, so based on the Pesukim, Rabbi say tenufa always requires involvement of the Kohen, involvement of the owner. How can you have two people waving the same exact carbon? So we'll say ultimately again, the owner holds the mincha, and the Kohen places his hands underneath the owner's hands. So we'll say, so interesting, I remember again when we did Sota, there was a whole discussion about what does it mean? The Kohen is placing his hands underneath the Sota's hands. So we had a whole discussion over there that again, it could very well be that essentially they're both holding the mincha just from different places, but it's called the Kohen placing his hands, so to speak, underneath the owner's hands. Ashkechan Sota. I know now that this applies to Sota. Nazira minal. And how do I know that it applies to Nazira as well? Asya kaf miso. The Gzera Shava of kaf from Sota. So therefore, I will say, what we've successfully done is shown that Allah Lamaisa, a woman, a Kohanes, is not permitted to do smicha, tenufa, hagasha, kmitza, haktara, malika, kabbalah, and hazah. The one sacrificial rite that a woman is involved in, but this has nothing to do with being a kohenes. The one sacrificial rite she's involved in is tenufa, is waving. That if either a woman is a sota, bringing the mincha of a sota, or a nazira, bringing ultimately the mincha of a nazira, she will do tenufa, the waving process, together with the kohen. Rabosai, shkoyach. Okay, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone.